Every major fraud that's occurred over the last 10 years, they come back to Wells Fargo, for example. They'll talk about, well, there was a culture of fraudulent behavior. I don't know if it's the primary motive or the primary cause of fraud, but I think it's a big auxiliary impact, and it perpetuates throughout the organization. So the IA has been big on this over the past 2 years. They said most folks do not undertake or do not audit culture. Have you guys in here, anybody in here have done a culture assessment or culture audit? Raise your hands if you have. There's a couple different ways to do it. We're going to this session is more discussion. The appendix of the slides is about 15 to 20 slides that are great questions that could build a questionnaire on culture. I'll take it a step further. The IA came out with this in 2016, and this is going to sound a little pitchy, but our book in 14 came out, and our second chapter is all about assessing culture. So we were a little bit ahead of the curve on this, and a lot of the slides in the appendix are from a supplement to our book. Do you have good culture? Overall, is your corporate culture healthy? I'm asking. I have no idea. And everybody's could be different based on your location. I don't think it'd be fair to say that everybody's culture would be the same. Raise your hand if you say you have good culture. Do you have a good corporate culture? Yes. Okay. If you're going to say yes, tell me why. Tell me why. Give me examples why you would say you have a good culture. Any ideas, any thoughts?
There's good corporate governance.
Good corporate governance, I think it's a great start. What else?
People value each other most of the time.
Overall, respect for each other, respect for the employees. Very good. What else? Yes, sir.
A strong foundation on Christian commitment.
I think you guys have or potentially have a unique culture. You want to make sure people buy into the message. If people buy into what you guys as an organization are trying to accomplish and support that message, people inherently are going to be more ethical and try to do the right things for the right reasons. Does that make sense? I think, how many of you guys have worked for for-profit companies? That's not the way it is in for-profit. I mean, yes, you can buy into the product, the message, but truly buying into the cause and what you guys are trying to accomplish, if you have employees that do that, I think they naturally are going to form a more healthy culture. So I think that's a very good point. What else? What are some other indications of good culture? Yes, ma'am?
Can you define what a good culture is?
That's what I'm trying to get you to do. No, you got kind of where I'm going with this, because a lot of people would say, I've got a really good corporate culture. Then I ask, well, tell me why it's good, and I get blank looks. It's easy to say it's good. It's hard to describe what's good. Your organization, what you would describe as good culture, is not going to work at Google or the U.S. Postal Service or other organizations. It's not going to work there. So it's very unique to each organization. The appendix, what I was mentioning earlier, and I'll make sure I flash it up, has a lot of questions to talk about your culture and to really understand what good culture or bad culture look like. But it could be very different based on the organization. All the things that you guys said, though, I think apply to good culture all the time. Good governance, general respect, and good treatment of the employees. And one thing we didn't hear yet, accountability and ownership, I think that's a great point. That wasn't where I was going to go, but I think that is a very good point. To make sure that people are accountable for their actions, accountable for their work, rewarded for their work. Communication. The #1 reason why people leave an organization is they said it's a lack of communication from management or their boss. They don't know what's happening. It's not money. It's not overall dissatisfaction. It's a lack of communication. So that's a big root of what I would say is not a very good culture. Like we talked about yesterday, communication from an organizational standpoint drives trust. Transparency drives trust with the employees, with auditors, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll talk about what good corporate culture really looks like. But going back to your question, I don't have a straight answer for you. I think that's why auditors tend to stay away from this subject. If my management team came to me and said, I want to do a corporate culture audit, I'd say, no, I'm not doing that. Why? Because until you've established criteria of what good is, I'm not going to touch it from an audit perspective.
Yeah.
Can I help them assess it? Yes, I can. But I want to know from management's perspective what they say is good, and then we can do that maybe in the future. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a great area to tackle, but as an auditor, in my opinion, you're kind of putting yourself out there a little bit. Am I going to go tell management, you've got bad culture. You've got bad tone at the top. Is that the battle I really want to fight? I mean, if it is, there's other ways to say it, but I think you need to talk about it, but I want to understand what the criteria is before I try to measure something. So these are some stats from the IA again. Lots of organizations just haven't undertaken this. One thing we'll talk about just theoretically is I think you can do almost a little bit of a corporate culture snapshot based on each audit you're doing. If you're in the IT class before, we talked about yes-no questions. A lot of these questions, I think you could phrase yes-no and have a good idea. Does the culture affect the control structure that we have here? Again, it's a little tough to really quantify that and say it's bad, but you guys have seen that before, right? Where you have good people, good controls, and they don't work very well because management doesn't really emphasize the importance. Raise your hand if you've had that happen before in one of your audits. I think that's somewhat common, isn't it? And you get to a tipping point where, especially with detective controls, for example, people are doing their jobs, they're doing them well, but they never find anything. A year, 2 years, and then they really stop looking for what they're supposed to look for anyway. And that's when the problems start to occur. I think corporate culture supports and makes sure that people know that the things you're doing are important and they should be done right. I'm a big soccer fan. So if you do some research on FIFA from an audit standpoint, from a culture standpoint. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about when I talk about FIFA and problems. I did this fraud presentation in Trinidad, and the head of soccer there, he was very much involved in a lot of this too. And he's viewed very differently. He's viewed as Robin Hood, someone giving back to the people, but he stole hundreds of millions of dollars. He just gave them a portion of it. If you look at any of these frauds, FIFA, Enron, we'll talk about Toshiba as well. Again, I don't think you could say the root cause of the fraud was the corporate culture, but the deterioration of the culture tended to allow fraud to occur easily. Does that make sense? Are you a bad parent if your child gets arrested? It's kind of, but it's the same thing, isn't it? If I have 1 or 2 employees that does something bad, is the whole organization, do we have bad culture? I can't answer that. I would say no in most cases. I think there's pockets of badness, of unethical behavior, but to say the entire organization's unethical, I think with FIFA though, there was a lot of people on the board level that were involved in the frauds. So in my opinion, they fostered a culture of fraudulent behavior, of unethical behavior. So I think there are cases where you could say the whole organization, the culture was bad, but I don't think you see that very often. Factors influencing corporate culture and undertaking the audit. Behavior model by executive management, they said this was one of the most effective ways for corporate culture to be affected or impacted and judged. Modeling the way, walking the walk. If management doesn't tolerate fraud, if management doesn't tolerate unethical behavior, They said that's one of the best examples, and I would agree. Going back to being a parent, I like using the parent comparisons, so I think they work. If I go out and steal something right in front of my kid, he's probably going to do the same thing. Heck, he's picked up some words that I am not proud of from me. So it is, I think that's a big aspect. Direct communication by other employees, going back to employee treatment, relationships. When people are happy at work, when they're happy with their coworkers, it makes life so much better. Establishment of code of conduct. You guys have a code of conduct, right? Is the code of conduct valuable? Let's talk about that real quick. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
What's the value of it? Yes, ma'am.
Setting up a set of values and rules in report with yourself and others.
But aren't those values known? Is it common knowledge? I guess that's what I'm asking. Do we really need a code of conduct to tell people how to act?
Yes, you did.
Might be sad a little bit, isn't it? Do you really need the code of conduct? I think there's a lot to be said. You've got to have a good code of conduct. But code of conduct is just a sheet of paper. Just a couple sheets. Unless it's supported by these other aspects that we're going to talk about, formal training, etc. Code of conduct is just another piece of paper. So I agree. You don't agree with me?
I disagree with you, I'm sorry.
Tell me, that's okay. Tell me why.
You know, it's not just a sheet of paper. It's, we, as a community, we comply with the same set of values in this organization. So if I sign my code of conduct here in your vision, means I agree with the values of the organization that I'm part of. Not the set of 8 values that everybody knows about. Your vision is about the way how I behave, the way how I behave with others. So I agree to behave from here, from Europe. I agree to behave in the report to my colleagues from other regions in the same way. They agree to behave the same way with me.
What's your name?
My name is Mihaela.
Mihala?
Yes.
Do you guys agree with Mihala? I go ahead.
Yeah, I think to some extent it's okay. To the extent that it identifies what is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior, it's okay. But I think I agree with your point that if it is not supported by proper conduct and exemplary behavior by the executive, training of the employees, people will forget about it.
And that's why it's always constantly reiterated. I've got a question. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to. Did I cut you off? I didn't mean to.
No.
Mihaela?
Yes.
When was the last time you read your code of conduct?
When was the last time when I read? I think months ago when I read it for audit.
Okay, let me ask you guys this. How many of you guys have never read your code of conduct? Be honest.
I'll say I have tried the code of conduct.
But you've never read it? So that makes it okay though, right?
No, I've written the code of conduct.
Is it practical?
Very practical. The code of conduct could be very general.
Yes.
But there are certain areas, for example, how I'm collecting from clients.
Yes.
Where we need to be very specific on what we can do and cannot do. So we help to establish a code of conduct for that specific area. So it's not
Gotcha.
necessarily an overarching. Yes, we do have a general code of conduct for all employees, but certain employees have certain other obligations which they need to take care of.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and you don't, I'll be honest with you, you don't necessarily see that in a lot of other organizations. They have the overarching code of conduct that's very generic and not much value. You guys take it a step further and show how it applies to your role. I think that's great. I think that does help it quite a bit. But I would still say it's a general guidance. Nobody's forcing you to do anything. These things push people in the right direction. So I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm right. I think it's just a different perspective. I think it's valuable, but again, I tell my son to do a lot of things, but he doesn't necessarily do them unless he sees the impact of not doing them. Does that make sense? It's got to be supported by management, by communication, etc. So I appreciate your comment. Thank you. And did you have another comment to that? Mihaela?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I mean, it's a reinforcement method, but which is not standing alone. We need to also to, it requires a number of other measures, but it is part of reinforcement measures.
Yeah, I think it's, I agree with you. It's that basic foundation that you've got to build from. Enforcement of code of conduct and disciplinary measures. It's a perfect example. If people are disciplined for breaking the code of conduct is worthless. Plain and simple. You see this in organizations all the time. People do something wrong, slapped on the wrist. Take it a step further. When an employee commits fraud, that employee should be terminated. If the boss should have caught that fraud, there should be ramifications to the manager as well. But you don't see that very often. And that's why the code of conduct, while it might be valuable, isn't as valuable because people don't believe it. People don't think it's going to be enforced. And then direct communication from other employees, we've got that twice. Because it was first and second. So those are a few things. You brought up what's good corporate culture, and I think it's a great question because it's hard to say. What's the personality, what's the DNA of the organization? It kind of goes back to, I do a course on leadership, very similar. What gets people to do over and above what they're supposed to do? What gets people to do the right thing all the time, not because they're getting paid, but because it's the right thing to do? So as to what that, again, it's more the DNA. A lot of it has to do with that executive management team as well. This is not written down anywhere. I think that's why we struggle with it too. It's unique to each organization. And there's going to be lots of subcultures. So regardless of what country you're in, the organization as a whole, I would hope, has a pretty overall, it has a culture. Then you've got maybe international nation specific, and then you've got departmental specific culture as well. All that impact the overall culture. That's what makes it difficult when you have 43,000 employees, guys, in hundreds of countries. To have one culture that kind of is pervasive to everyone, it's extremely difficult. We'll talk about how to do that. It's very difficult to do. And sometimes, I've worked in organizations, I'll go to one facility to the next, completely different, like night and day. And yes, I think that's normal, but the basic value system cannot change. And I'm going to go back, I'm going to say that Michaela is, I'm going to support you on your point. The code of conduct helps teach people, or make sure people understand the basic codes of conduct, the basic values, regardless of where you're at and what you're doing. It gives you those basic standards. So, I think it's a good jumping off point. How do corporate cultures form? It's kind of like an amoeba. It starts out by the founders of the organization, and then it can kind of spread. Uber, for example. Have you guys read any articles about Uber and their corporate culture? If you get a chance to read them, they're very good, they're very interesting. Uber was a small startup. The culture was a fun, young group of people that like to party and have fun and make money. And as they growed exponentially over the last 10 years, just like we didn't talk about this in IT, but companies outgrow their IT environment, their IT infrastructure. Companies outgrow their cultural infrastructure. So as they got larger as an organization, they couldn't live with that culture anymore. So what happened? The CEO was out last year, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of harassment charges. He was sending out emails that I read. I think they're well-natured, but they send the wrong message. So every company is very, very different, and those values tend to sprout from either the mission or the founders of the organization. Hey, William.
Me?
Let's see here. Our key players we talked about. We'll talk about reinforcement as well. This is a great example of the, or actually the next slide. Toyota. Toyota. See, they're flying in, and I can't stand when they're flying in. No. I can hear her talking on the phone, that's why. Oh, she's translating. I didn't know. I thought she was on a phone call. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. And I keep hearing this low voice whispering, and I'm like, it's driving me insane. What is that? So thank you. Yeah, I don't get impacted by much, but I was like, what is going on here? And I dealt with translators, but they were standing next to me most of the time versus in the back. Yeah. So Toyota, in the mid-'80s, they developed the Lean Six Sigma approach. But a lot of companies in the United States, what did we try to do? We tried to replicate that. It didn't work. That Lean Six Sigma kind of attitude, let's see here, focused on relentless process improvement, dedication to customer satisfaction, advanced knowledge of statistics, employee suggestions, very advanced teaming, consensus management, etc. All these things the Detroit companies tried to apply. It just didn't work at all. And going back to, you can't replicate culture from one organization to the next. Even if you're the responsible party or the founder of each organization, every corporate culture is going to be different. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this comment fully. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. It makes sense, but I waver on it. This whole subject of corporate culture, it's such an intriguing, it's such a great discussion, but there's no clear, it's all gray, guys. There's no real clear answers on a lot of these subjects. So, from an audit standpoint, every audit you guys go to, this is what I was mentioning earlier, you might be able to do a little bit of an assessment of corporate culture. You've got to understand who the key players are. You've got to understand, is that toe to the top good? But it's more than that. Is if X, Y, and Z, so perfect example, we talk about controls. Controls are important, right? When we talk about an AP manager processing a payment, if the head of your organization went to AP and said, I need this check cashed immediately, I don't care about sign-offs, I need it cashed now, would the AP manager do that? My question, in your organization, would they?
Sometimes, most likely.
I would say, and again, you guys might be different, 75% of organizations, the answer is yes. They would cash it because the CEO or whomever told them to do it. You've got all these great policies and procedures in place, you've got all these great controls, but could I circumvent all of them with one sentence? Yes. Good corporate culture, going back to your comment, I think would empower the employees to say no, no matter who it is. Or I'm going to say, hey, I've got to do these things to follow policy, no matter who it is asking for. I think you're going to, in this situation, the AP manager is going to risk their job if they cash a check. They're also going to risk their job if they don't cash it, either way. But we want to make sure that we're empowering, and that goes back to your comment on accountability. We're empowering our employees to do the right things. Enron, for example, had extensive business conduct policy. Great stated tone at the top. Auditors love to, we talked about the business conduct policy, making it we're sure we're including it. And this is kind of where I was going with my thought, is do employees really know what it is? Do employees really practice what they preach? You know, does it mean something to them? You know, great companies like Wells Fargo, for example, had all the code of conducts, all the ethics policies in the world. Fraud still occurred. Why? Well, a lot of that, to me, was tone at the top. But again, we've got to make sure that we understand it fully from an audit perspective, where it kind of renders our audits, our controls audits, worthless, meaningless. Because again, I can have all the controls in the world, but if management can override them at any time, how important are they really? Agree, disagree, what are y'all's thoughts? Any thoughts? Yes, sir.
So, how best can we evaluate or assess the corporate culture of an organization?
Give me 1 second. All right, I've got an appendix to this, and again, Ryan has all the slides, so you guys should get these. These are, again, kind of out of our chapter 2 of our book. These are all selected dimensions of corporate culture. Things to consider. Then the next few slides go into each one. Questions to ask. Again, they don't all apply to your organization, and they're not going to fit whether it's good or bad. But these are all things I think that could be considered or could be built into maybe a management questionnaire or a team questionnaire that I could at least get perspective. Do I have a culture issue? I think on a whole, and we'll come back to this, I would say that most organizations, I think this is fair, most organizations think they have a good corporate culture. Is that a fair statement? I think it is. Most organizations think they have a good culture. But it's really hard to say until you peel back the layers of the onion. So I think you could create maybe a little bit of a questionnaire and start to assess where they're at. But it's a tough question to answer. I'll be honest with you. It's a very difficult question to answer because every company is going to have a different answer for that on what corporate culture, what good corporate culture looks like. But all these slides, the next like 15 slides, are all about questions to consider asking. Yes, ma'am. I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. So I think that when we all do audits, there's different observations that we come across from talking to different staff that really is qualitative information that could be called hearsay or biased information. And so I think the challenge with talking about culture
Yes.
is that
It's subjective.
information is qualitative.
Yes, I 100% agree with you.
How do you bring about a discussion of corporate culture when they're going to say, oh, this person's just airing out, their frustration with me, and a lot of times it's difficult going to HR. You don't necessarily want to bring it to HR. You have this code of confidentiality.
Yeah, no, and is it our role to bring something to HR versus management? That's a good point.
It's a challenge.
I would say that, and again, it's hard to apply this, trust but verify. If I'm interviewing somebody and they say, well, management isn't adhering to our objectives or our code of conduct, I'd probably get a better understanding of that. Then I would probably ask in a roundabout way, not directly, try to understand that more. Go ahead.
No, I think it's more an example, a current example
Please.
for me is that, oh, the employee's not empowered, or my manager doesn't back me up in meetings.
Yeah.
And if you hear this recurringly, not through one employee, but 5 employees, then the question becomes, what is the best way to share this information in a way that doesn't incriminate the direct reports,
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't make you blow up in HR?
Sure.
So it's a challenge.
Sure,
But
and-
in a way that you're able to communicate that this is an issue.
Yeah, I would say going back to his initial question, I would probably, if I'm going to go about this, every audit I'm going to have some type of very high level corporate culture assessment built into the audit. I'd ask those questions, and then I would give them the results as a separate not report, but just here's the stats, here's something that's been called out. It's something you guys might want to consider, or it's maybe we can do some follow-up work. So I'll give you just a side note example. I was working with a company, a bank in San Francisco a couple weeks ago, a bank of 40 auditors. Audit director, CA, great guy, really, really knows his stuff, very friendly, outgoing. It was a real quiet room. We were doing critical thinking. As soon as he left the room with 30 minutes left, everybody else started talking and engaging. As soon as he left. So he was, I took a ride with him after and I talked to him about that. And I told him, I said, I don't fully understand it either, but he's also a big guy physically. And I said, people might be just intimidated by you. But man, it's hard for them to see that because A, they don't want to believe it, and B, they don't see it. So I think that fits well into what you just said. I think making sure that you have a kind of independent assessment. I wouldn't say it was good or bad. I'd say here are the results of our assessment. If you guys want to, do something further on this, maybe that's something we can help you with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's very tough because you're right. It's that subjectivity is tough because I don't want to take one person's comment and say, well, you've got an issue with empowerment. It's like, and does not empowering your employees make a bad corporate culture? I would say no, it doesn't. But if I see 5 to 10 different things, then it might lead me to believe that there's things to fix. Yes, sir.
Yes, I think you partially answered the question, but who would normally initiate that discussion for that independent assessment? Because I'm thinking they feel they're doing everything right.
Yeah.
And as an auditor, you may assess that there's probably, let's just say, first you've assessed decisions are being made top down, or there's a spiritual risk. But if you're going to do that audit on spiritual risk, you're going to be touching on the core of the DNA. So I mean, who would really initiate that discussion?
Unless
maybe from your experience, I mean.
Unless there's a problem indicated. Or you put it on your risk assessment as a key risk for the organization, and let the in the for-profit companies I work with, the audit committee would say, well, we want you guys to do something because we all agree it's a high-risk area. So putting it at high risk or management's request. But again, the management request, to your point, doesn't happen that often. It's got to come from like an audit committee. But let's be honest, guys, going back to what is good corporate culture. If the president of my organization requests an assessment of corporate culture, isn't that an indication that there's probably good corporate culture to an extent because he wants that information? Does that make sense? I mean, because they want to know if it's good or not. They want to be transparent. A lot of organizations would say, I don't, or I already know, to your point. And I think that's when I get a little scared that people don't fully understand. They understand what they're saying to their direct reports, but do they understand that message doesn't permeate through the organization? I think that's key. I think that's what happened at Uber. He had a lot of direct reports, a lot of close friends. Travis something or other, I forgot his last name. But then when it started to permeate through the organization, there were at different levels that he wasn't touching much. People didn't know him, didn't understand his message, and misconstrued his message. And so that's why there was lots of allegations moving forward. So I think it's got to start at the audit committee, or from a purely audit perspective, the audit risk assessment. And I would assume in most organizations that's at least the medium risk unless you've had some issues, and then it might jump up to high risk.
Dan, sir?
Yes.
I was just thinking when you said maybe we put it in the risk register, then I was saying it is not the auditor who will put it there. And when you will suggest that this is a high risk, they might say for us it's not a high risk.
No.
But then you have talked of audit risk assessment. Then of course that risk assessment for us to say it's medium or high for culture, there might be a trigger or something that our skepticism, we see that there is something wrong here. We have to, and we put it forward to them.
But that's human nature, to your point. I think it's a very good one. We are reactive as humans. We are not proactive. It's never going to happen to us. It happens to other people. I think putting it medium would just be, from my point of view, the quantity, the number of employees. When I have a big organization, it's hard to keep that message permeating throughout. So as we grow, I would say it's medium risk just because of the size. But I think to your point, I think most people would say, well, it's a low risk area. I don't know about that. I think that'd be, I don't know if I'd agree with it, but I would say that management probably has that perspective. I think your point's well taken. So I skipped forward a lot of slides to show you the appendix. There's a few other things I want to cover. We talked about GM. We talked about Toyota, but GM in the 80s too, they had a significant corporate culture shift. Alfred Sloan was their CEO for many years, but he was very difficult to work for. But that mentality worked in the 50s and 60s. Very domineering personality. It was a do as you're told, command and control structure. However, in the 80s, as the business environment changed, we talked about Toyota earlier, there's companies that are not working with the structure. There's companies that people are attracted to because of their work style. They started having a lot of issues, errors, etc., a lot of recalls, and they lost a ton of money in the 80s because they just didn't adjust to any of those dynamic changes. Again, it's not just the organization, it could be the environment we're in too. How many of you guys are under, it's 25 and under in here, anybody? 25 and under. The kids, those kids today, I sound like an old man, they're changing the workforce and the culture dynamics significantly. I don't want to bring up politics, okay, so bear with me. But Trump, when he tweets things, okay, he goes overboard. But that is a great medium to get to a lot of people. Again, I'm not talking about content, I'm just talking about the medium. So our company's adjusting their communication style to the demands of the new workforce. And that's why I think we talked about it a little bit yesterday, audit reports. If audit reports are too long, as we have millennials get into management positions, guys, they're not going to read it, period. I was joking around yesterday talking about our emoji is going to start showing up in audit reports. I don't know if we're that far off from it, honestly. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but you've got to continue to evolve with the culture. GM did not do that here. Companies with significant growth, like we talked about, they outgrow their own culture. And going to your comment on low, it's low risk, many don't see the need for formalization of our value system as a small organization, but they outgrow that infrastructure. They don't want the formalization. But what I've seen is you need it. You need that foundation to start from. I think there is a way to get corporate culture to a certain extent perpetuating through all aspects of the company. I think you've got to have a very objective-driven corporate culture. It's hard to do. It's easy to talk about. It's much harder to actually do. But we don't have any up there. I know they're up in that room. Don't you guys have some of your mission statements up here in the other room? I saw some posters. If I want to make sure people are doing the right things for the right reasons, I'm going to make sure everybody has a good understanding of our mission and our objectives. Everybody. And I think a lot of companies do it, and I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but they have that as the pillars of their organization and how each employee is ranked, or how they're rewarded. Because each employee has to know how what they do impacts the organization. Not just the mission, it could be other objectives too. But everybody's got to be aligned and at least have a good understanding of why I'm doing what I'm doing. We talked about this in audit yesterday. A lot of people don't fully understand what we do. If we get their negative perspective away, they'll probably be more open if they truly understand that we're trying to help them achieve their objectives versus hinder their objectives. So making sure that whatever that mission and vision is, it permeates through the organization. This takes time, it takes a lot of communication. It can work, but it's very time consuming. Do you guys understand how what you do attaches to the overall mission of your company? Raise your hand if you say yes to that. You do understand. So, I know we're not good at hand raises, but I saw like 4 or 5 people raise their hands, that's it. So think about that for a second, guys.
Guys, better raise your hands.
At least your team, right? We've got to make sure that every employee kind of attaches. Like I said, with not-for-profits, you've got to buy into it. It's got to be important to them. If it's important to them, it makes it easier to have employees that obey the code of conduct, that want to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. It's not only the mission, too, it's the strategy of the business, the key business objectives. Where my area is trying to accomplish, I want to understand that. I want to understand what I'm doing and how that attaches to that objective. People have got to be working towards the same goals. We're all a team. If we're working all together, those goals are in reach. If we are going to set business objectives and set personal objectives based on the mission of the organization, we've got to make sure that they're vetted appropriately, that they are reasonable, they are achievable, they are smart as well. That could go, I mean, we could go down a whole different route there, but that's another thing that needs to be considered. Corporate culture permeates everything inside an organization. So, something specific to not-for-profits. Oxfam, you guys have heard of? Do you know what happened? Raise your hand if you don't know. Everybody kind of knows? Okay, so they had employees of Oxfam doing inappropriate things in foreign countries when they should have been giving aid. Is that a quick way of summarizing what happened?
Yeah.
Say again? They were partying. They were having a good time while they're trying to help. They were supposed to be providing relief effort. So how does that happen, guys? Is that a bad culture? Is it a few bad employees? You tell me. Let's have a discussion on this. What does that really tell us? Because it wasn't 1 or 2 employees. It was a lot of them. And if I'm not mistaken, this isn't the first time it happened. In some of these relief situations, they had this occur more than a couple times. Yes, sir.
I think it was a bad culture even in their own context, because we hear that they were aware about it 4 or 5 years before, but there was no consequence for bad action.
So that goes back to one of the comments we talked about earlier.
Disciplinary. So within their own context, it was bad culture.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I ask the question a different way?
Please.
Is there any organization in the world, government, non-government, corporate, where there's never been, let's say, sex scandals?
Yes.
Which one?
My organization.
More than one employee.
But no, I said it in a joking manner, but not really, because you're right. So the smaller organization you are, the easier it is to manage. When you get to hundreds of thousands of employees, this stuff happens.
Yeah, you talk about churches, mosques, you talk about any religion.
Yes.
Exactly.
Where does it stop? So my sense is not that the organization culture is wrong, but it's more that it's typically, as you grow bigger, there are a few bad eggs in Raffles.
100% agree with everything you just said. However, I think there's ways to mitigate the risk. As we grow, we're going to make sure that the vetting process for employees should get tougher, because we have less oversight of those employees, so we should vet them out more on the front end. On the back end, we've got to make sure they understand our values, our code of conduct, etc. And then when one of these things happens, and we prove it out, we fire them. Actually, we might not fire them, we might try to get them prosecuted if it's a legal activity. And we take it very seriously, and then We socialize that to the organization. We tell them, without impeding on person's HR regulations, I'm going to talk about, hey, we had this happen, and here's how we addressed it. We take this very seriously. We're there for this. They were doing this. That's inappropriate behavior. We're not going to take that. And I'll take it a step further, and I think this is where a lot of organizations fail. Transparency. Getting ahead of the message. In this case, it might have happened 4 or 5 years ago. What did they try to do? Sweep it under the rug, right? My daughter, I do a course on crisis management, and I interviewed my daughter, and I said, you're 75%, you did something at school that's wrong, but based on your perspective, it might have been okay. The teacher says to you, I'm not sure if I'm going to call your parents. What do you do when you get home? She made a very poignant statement. My son was very similar. She said, everybody finds out everything eventually. So if I get the opportunity, I want you to hear my side of the story. I want to control the message. So when this stuff happens, instead of hiding it, the company should be the first one out and say, look, we had this issue, we're doing an internal investigation, we're going to do this independent investigation, and we're going to handle it appropriately. I actually think you build so much more credibility when you handle things the right way. But you don't see organizations with that mentality. And I think that kind of drives that negative corporate culture, because that permeates, hey, I did this, and nothing happened. So I can do whatever I want as an employee. So I agree with you. I think there are a few bad apples, but I think you can minimize the impact of those bad apples with a lot of the things we talked about in the appendix, the questions you ask, the culture it has. We'll go back to what you said, the culture of accountability, and making sure people are held accountable and empowered as well. Does that make sense, everybody? Please.
Where do you draw the line between what is internal information and what is external information? Yes, you take action internally, but where do you start to publicize in the, in the Times newspaper that I did this? And that's where I think there's a blurring of lines. Where I personally see that there are certain things as an organization you would take action, but you're not necessarily going to publicize this externally. So there's and I think over the period of time, we're finding that people externally want to see internal information, which may or may not be a problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I will always go back to, a scandal isn't a scandal if you get ahead of the message. And I agree with you. It's easy for me to say companies should do these things, but they're also making themselves potentially liable for lawsuits by doing this, by getting ahead of it. But think about it, guys. A lot of times, it's because people held on to the information. If people got ahead of the message and controlled the message, it would change your perspective on a lot of things. Companies with security breaches, for example. Instead of hiding it like Yahoo, like Target did, why not come out and say, look, we had a security breach, here's the issue, here's how we're going to address it. Instead, they hide it for years, and you lose a lot of credibility. So I agree with everything you're saying. It's a fine cost-benefit between getting ahead of it and not saying anything. And with that, we're going to wrap up. Again, guys, but if you get a chance, read about these organizations. These are just a few of many that have had major blow-ups. Is it fair to say that they have bad corporate culture? I don't think it is. I think the example with Wells Fargo, I could say yes, because it came from the top, the message, aid is great, open 8 accounts, but when people called the whistleblower hotline, people were fired. And that shows the negative culture permeated from the top down. The rest of these, again, I don't know if I'd say the whole culture is bad, or they had pockets of bad apples that were doing whatever they wanted. Here's some things to consider. Pay attention to the actions, not the statements. What type of employee succeeds? What type of employee fails? Are good behaviors rewarded? Are bad behaviors not? Or not penalized? Again, it's just such a twisted, commingled mix of actions and statements. But overall, will the culture impact the employee's actions in either a good or bad way? And with that, we got like a minute for questions. And again, chapter 2 of my book, All about corporate culture. If you're interested in buying a couple copies, I don't want to go home with any of them. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Should internal audit be auditing culture? Because say once there is a toxic culture,
Yeah.
there is a question like who gets promoted, what type of employees succeed. Do you think audit can change that?
I don't think, our goal isn't to, we're a change agent, we talked about this yesterday, but I think with culture, we should be a microphone or a megaphone for the organization. We want to make sure the organization management knows what the culture is, but I don't know if we're going to change it. I think we just want to make sure they're aware of it. Do we want to undertake it? I'll be honest with you, based on the other question, I don't know if you want to undertake it unless you start seeing issues. Unless you go out to an audit and you see 3 or 4 or 5 different employees that aren't doing the right thing and there is no ramifications of that. And you start to realize that it's going to impact what people are doing in their day-to-day roles, in their control behaviors. So, can I answer the question, do we want to undertake corporate culture audit? I don't know if I can answer that. I think, and I'm going to say it, and it's embarrassing to say, it depends. Depends. Yes, sir.
Is there any reason for example, an organization where there is no culture for accountability, and for an auditor to raise an issue on culture, or even to raise an issue where that culture is not there, and yet the auditor is accounting to the person, to the same person who.
Yeah, it's. I would say again, we want to report factual statements. So if I see instances where there's a significant lack of accountability, maybe not in the audit report, but maybe outside of it, in a memo, maybe it's just a verbal discussion, I'd say, look, this is something that we've seen and it's been consistent over this audit. We're not bringing up an audit issue, but it's something that could be an impact from a risk perspective going forward. If I think it's important enough, I might include it in my next risk assessment and say that lack of accountability or the corporate culture is high risk because of some of the things we saw before. But it's hard, you're right, because I'm telling somebody that's forcing that lack of accountability or lack of empowerment. So it's, guys, we're not auditors because the job's easy, let's be honest. It's tough, it's a challenging role. And these would be very, very challenging conversations. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was just going to make another comment. I think we all come into this under the assumption that people want to do the right thing, and I think people don't always.
Do you assume that?
I'm sorry.
Is that something you assume, that people want to do the right thing?
Well,
maybe I'm just an old jaded man. I don't think that.
We talk about culture or good culture.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that there's so many pressures on our organizations from all sides, and it's the reality. Like you just said, it's costly to do the right thing, and a lot of times it comes at personal sacrifice. So just thinking of whistleblowers.
Yeah.
They're not rewarded. They're not lauded as heroes.
It's harder to do the right thing, isn't it? It's harder to do the right thing than status quo.
I mean, just as we talk about culture, I think just remembering that, especially as auditors, I think we feel that oftentimes, and hence we don't audit culture because it would come oftentimes at personal sacrifice.
Yeah, and I talk about this in ethics. The biggest determinant of someone being ethical or not is inside here. It's if I can sleep at night because I did the right thing. And it's something you can't measure a lot, you're right. But I think that it is very difficult to do the right thing. It's much harder to do the right thing than status quo. I agree with everything you said. One more question? Saw another hand? Yes, sir.
I'm just looking at how culture is influenced to a greater extent by the bigger culture in the country.
Yes, great question.
And then also, even within the organization, we know that the top leadership has a big influence. The tone they set at the top influences, and as leaders come and go, you will see the culture will be also changing, either for the better or for the worse.
So you could almost say, and this is where I struggle with this myself, if we don't have good tone at the top, we do not have good corporate culture. I don't want to say that, but if you go back to it a lot of times, a lot of the primary foundation of good corporate culture is good leadership.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a complete direct correlation all the time, but it matters a lot. And when you have the right people in the right leadership positions, it's important. I'll leave it at that. And you're right, the culture of the country, that will permeate through that division, and that's got to be accounted for as well.
Because a lot of times, even if you take things like corruption, you go into certain environment.
And corruption is normal.
It's a normal stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, especially within some amounts, you know, it's very normal. So when you talk about, hey, this is not acceptable, they go, hey, I mean, where is this guy coming from? You know, we do this all the time. It's acceptable.
Honestly, it's a fine balance between acceptable and practical application. I'm with you. Is it still illegal? Yeah. If it is, then it's a problem. Yeah. But I'm with you, but it's been culturally accepted that you have under the table kickbacks. But again, from an audit standpoint, right, that's a problem. So you're right. It's a balance when you're going to have very potentially difficult conversations that are not going to be fun, but they will be a growth opportunity for sure. Any others? I think we're breaking for lunch till 1:30 now.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.